This is The Metro on 1019 at WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. II. Whether it's through the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the U.S. territories that are governed by colonial administration models like Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, evidence of colonization is embedded in the United States government. The place we now call Detroit, or Huawei-Yintong, the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Three Fires Confederacy, has a unique place in United States colonial history. The people of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, are collectively the Anishinaabe, were subjects of colonialism, violence, and displacement, first by European settlers, then by the United States government. That process was carried out and is now documented by bureaucracy, or what scholars call colonial administration. Maggie Blackhawk is the Moses H. Grossman Professor of Law at the NYU Law School. She's an expert in colonial administration, law, and history, and she's in Detroit today participating in a symposium at Wayne State called Imperial Administration, Law, Colonialism, and the Growth of the Administrative State. Professor Blackhawk spoke to Metro producer David Lyons about what we can learn today from the bureaucratic records of the past to help better understand U.S. colonialism in the U.S. and Michigan.
My work really goes back to the founding and the ways in which the U.S. started to govern areas that were seen as outside within the territory of the U.S., but outside the general population. So the Northwest Territory that Michigan is a part of was governed before the founding under military rule, under non-representative administrative government. A form of government that resembled British colonial government, but built upon it in innovative ways, and trying to bring the population into the beliefs and culture and political values and constitutional visions of the founding. And so it was a different form of government, and it incorporated from its very beginning places like Michigan. So this form of government continued forward under territorial government and then finally colonial government, and specifically colonial administration, because they saw the best way to govern these areas is through administrative bureaucracy, delegated government, rather than governing it directly through Congress, for example. Mm-hmm. It continued through in Michigan, even into the 20th century. So, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with Frank Murphy. He actually is a famous Michigander and specifically Detroiter. So he was born in Michigan, Frank Murphy, and he served as the mayor of Detroit during the Great Depression. And he was actually trained in colonial administration at the University of Michigan. And while he was mayor, he actually commissioned or oversaw the Arts Commission that commissioned the Rivera Court, where we're going to have our dinner for our symposium. It was commissioned while he was mayor. So he immediately went from serving as mayor to Detroit and bringing a little New Deal, the progressive era reforms that have administrative science of government at the center, to serve as Governor General of the Philippines. There he brought the little New Deal to the Philippines. And he actually brought his professors from the University of Michigan, particularly Joseph Ralston Hayden, to govern the Philippines and to bring them through scientific administrative government, forms of intervention, best ways of governing. And then he came back and served as governor of Michigan immediately. And then he was appointed to the Supreme Court as a justice on the United States Supreme Court. So he's an incredibly famous national figure as a U.S. Supreme Court justice, but he has a deep history within Michigan, and particularly even into the DIA's Rivera Court, where we're hoping to bring this deep conversation together about all these forms of government that are deeply related, both from the contemporary Anishinaabe art exhibit into the Rivera Court commissioned by a colonial administrator that was governing Detroit at the time, even to its depictions and in the illustrations and the artwork itself. But I can get to that in a moment. Mm-hmm. But the history is itself traced not only from the founding onward, but specifically into Detroit, Michigan.
That's so interesting because the idea of history just kind of being in front of us everywhere, but we just aren't aware of all the connections. The Rivera Court has so much meaning to people in Detroit and beyond. And that I've heard so many stories about the Rivera Court, but I haven't heard it told through that lens and heard its role related to Frank Murphy. And it kind of raises a question for me, which is kind of what other forms of evidence do we have of colonial administration just kind of out and about? Or maybe it's just things that people are generally aware of, because I think this is something that we look at, let's say, departments in the federal government or even locally in Michigan, and these are kind of vestiges of the past that maybe change and take on a different form or a different purpose over time, but they start out as colonial administration. Are there any examples that you could draw on?
Yes. So there are paradigmatic, easy to identify examples in forms of administration on the federal level, like the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the governing of insular affairs, so the territories, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and Guam. All of these governments are governed and administered through the U.S. in a system that still looks very similar to the systems that were designed by colonial administrators in the past. So we have a delegated form of administrative government that oversees the self-determination of what are colonies run by the U.S., overseeing their constitutions, running their elections, overseeing their laws, approving and vetoing them, and appointing different federal officials that actually serve within the government of these colonies. In 2016, the U.S. intervened into Puerto Rico's government, even though it had designated as a commonwealth in 1952. It intervened into its government and began running it through a commission appointed by the President of the United States, rather than a government elected by the people of Puerto Rico. And so you can see the most paradigmatic examples of colonial administration today in those bodies. However, there are also examples of the ways, as I described for Frank Murphy, in which the colonial administration and public administration blurred. Those administrators who saw scientific government through bureaucracy as a wonderful solution to the problems of both savagery and civilization and modernity brought these same innovations back to all of these cities and states through little New Deal programs like what Frank Murphy brought to the city of Detroit. And so what he did there, for example, was he brought non-political forms of government into the city through commissions, which is how, so they're like delegated executive power to essentially run things like the Arts Commission that Edsel Ford was president of to commission the Rivera Court. He actually donated personal money, but he was president of the Art Commission that oversaw it. And so this form of nonpartisan, scientific government by experts that was delegated was actually a form of government we now see all over the U.S. because many of our primary leaders, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Taft, all of these leaders were themselves scholars of colonial administration or practitioners of colonial administration that moved seamlessly between administration in colonial contexts like the Philippines and non-colonial contexts like Detroit and the state of Michigan. And they brought all of these lessons back and forth as to how government works to solve social problems. And they started to envision a best practice where government was really the best at solving social problems when it was insulated from partisan politics, insulated from judicial review, and staffed by technical experts who were trained in disciplines and deeply steeped in science.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET. I'm David Lyons. My guest is Maggie Blackhawk. She's an expert in colonial administration, law, and history in the U.S. and a professor of law at the NYU Law School. We're talking about how colonial forms of governance show up in the United States today and what we can learn from the archives of bureaucracy. Maggie, I'm curious how these lessons from the past, things that are really kind of patterns that we've seen through United States government and how colonial administrative ways of governance have kind of made their way through the years. Where are we now? Because it doesn't seem like a non-political administrative apparatus is kind of the thriving thing. It seems like things are very political now. But at the same time, I'm curious about what instances you might even draw on now, because our administrative agencies and institutions on the federal level are being really upended. They're funded differently or less. They are serving different purposes than they used to in a way that at least feels novel for the last few decades. I'm curious how you view our present moment, since you have kind of a much broader view and a different lens to look through.
The science of the study of colonial government was ubiquitous up until around the 1940s and 1950s. But this field was erased during the Cold War era. It was left to the side. So colonial administration and government in this particular way of non-subject populations was just seen as fascism. And so its remnants, what imperial theorists call the boomerang of empire, the idea necessarily that the techniques and practices and ideologies of colonialism always come back to govern both non-subject but also then subject, so metropolitan central populations. It's pretty readily studied. Colonial governments have long used the colonies as laboratories of governance, trying to find new ways to govern, and then they bring those new ideas back home. That's very common. And so if you lose the study of the colonial administration, you lose the understanding that parts of the U.S. government have had their roots in these areas. And so you forget ways that they can be abused by shaping them in different forms. And the same bureaucratic apparatuses without those technocratic experts, with biased partisans, ideologues running them, were quite literally used for despotic government, non-representative, top-down government that was used not to represent those populations, but to transform them, to persuade them, to change them into something else by the U.S. Mm-hmm. So what we're seeing now in the transformation of them and the repurposing of them to use them as levers to try and reshape education, culture, ideology, religion of the people on the ground is actually what very similar bureaucratic forms have been used for by the U.S. in the context like the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Indian country. In very similar ways. And so the lessons in our own history, both in the misuse of these bureaucratic infrastructure, is in our history as our forms of resistance and lessons about how we best structure these bureaucracies to keep them from being despotic. Those lessons are all there, but we've lost all of it because we failed to ever admit, even in the first instance, that the U.S. has ever been an empire, has ever governed colonies, even though we still govern colonies every day through these colonial administration agencies like the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's hard not to think of a couple of recent examples. You mentioned levers of power being used and technocracy. I mean, we've seen the government shut down debates, and very much that's like, hey, what will we choose to fund? Will it be food assistance? Will it be healthcare subsidies? I don't know that this counts under your definition, but National Guard deployments in cities across the United States questions their self-determination when the order comes from the president, and the governor or mayor of that place says, no, thank you, and they're there anyways.
So the intervention of military power to bring forms of persuasion and force around the colonies is longstanding, from the Northwest Territory to the Louisiana Territory onward, even to one of the last uses of the National Guard under the same statute that the Trump administration is drawing on, actually reestablished colonial government in the Virgin Islands. After the hurricane there had disrupted the colonial government to such an extent that the native population began resisting. And they used the National Guard to tamp that down. And so this is not an unforeseen set of practices and processes. We actually have a long history of doing these things, but because we haven't interrogated that history, not even revealed it, but begun to interrogate it as a history that we don't want to repeat, we have left those administrative structures and forms of federal power and forms of federal constitutionalism in place that we're essentially wanting to now reuse and reapply to new populations. So, for example, the birthright citizenship executive order, the government, the administration is trying to defend that stripping of birthright citizenship from certain children born to parents who were here temporarily or who were undocumented. They're trying to use the example of Native Americans who were not extended constitutional birthright citizenship because of this colonial structure, and to use that same example quite literally in their brief to defend the constitutionality of doing it to another population today. So it's the exact same structures that they're drawing on, and they do this often behind the scenes within executive legal reasoning that we're often not privy to.
Yeah, I think it's very hard for an everyday person to be able to look at kind of the long history of Supreme Court rulings and the creation of certain administrative institutions in the United States and really tie that story together. It's very hard. That's why we need people like you to explain it to us. I would like to end with a question about the symposium and the initiative that you're going to be launching. What do you want people to take away from this convening?
This is Detroit. I think you all, to a certain extent, have the remnants of individuals like Frank Murphy all around you, folks who specialized in colonial administration at the University of Michigan. All of that history is there right in front of you, as well as the ongoing colonial relationship between the United States and Native nations within the borders of Michigan State. And so the past, the present, and the future of colonial administration is something that the public should be aware of, and hopefully we'll start to have a conversation about, not just because we need to have a deeper conversation about decolonization because we remain a colonial government managing Native nations and overseeing them, but also because it affects the central population of the U.S. also. It affects everyone. To have these forms of government be part of our past and still be present today, but have us not be aware of them. I think Detroit is a very special and very important place to begin that conversation.
Maggie Blackhawk is a professor of law at New York University. She's in Detroit today for a symposium on U.S. imperialism and colonial administration at Wayne State. She'll also be the keynote speaker at a dinner that will follow at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Coming up, a major exhibition featuring contemporary Native American art is now open at the DIA. Our conversation with the curator and the museum's director is coming up next. Also later, we'll try out a Detroit-themed crossword puzzle. Go ahead and call us at 313-577-1019 if you want to, give your best guess on some of the clues.